My name is Lilian Posadas, and I am the Repatriation and Community Research Manager for the Autry Museum of the American West, which is based in Los Angeles, California.
Hi, I'm Özge Gençay Üstün. I'm the Objects Conservator at the Autry Museum of the American West.
My name is Desiree Martinez, and I'm a Gabrielino Tongva community member. Our tribe is focused in the Los Angeles area, and I was hired as an independent consultant to help the Autry communicate with the Gabrielino Tongva community as well as other communities for the ancestors and collections that they have in their repository.
Hello, my name is Karima Kennedy Richardson. I'm the Associate Curator of Archaeology and Osteology at the Autry Museum of the American West.
So many of us work with museums right now, most of the Autry Museum, but many of us have histories of working with many different institutions. And we want to recognize that sometimes museums, universities, archives, libraries, these places can sometimes carry histories that can be grant a very intimidating kind of aura for a lot of different communities and can create a lot of distance then between these institutions and communities. And one of the ways in which we like to try to attempt to counter that is by working closely with communities, indigenous communities in particular, to establish relationships and to develop collaborative projects to move the work that interests both of our communities and forward. And one of the ways in which we are striving to do better in that respect is to find ways to increasingly humanize the work that we do with the collections, particularly the ancestral remains that are in museum collections. The Autry Museum does have ancestors in our collection, and we are required to comply with NACRA, although we are a private institution. We do receive federal funds. And so we're going to discuss the various ways in which we are trying on our own to humanize this work with the ancestors, but also to encourage others to think of ways in which they can also humanize the ancestors and other sacred objects in their collections. So we're going to start off with
Okay. So conservators working with museum collections are conditioned to a certain type of terminology. Like, for example, inevitably, when materials has been objectified in museums, when an object enters a collection, it gets a number. Maybe it's exhibited behind a plexiglass. So it gets distant from its culture, somewhat gets distant from its culture. When caring for ancestors, however, there is a need to find common terminology and the language. And this can be done through collaborative work with our NADPRA coordinator, archaeologists, and the communities, working together closely to talk about sensitive and sensible conservation treatments, and conservation terminology is very important for conservation to develop the condition assessments. And we need to be open to change and to strengthen the relationships, build and strengthen the relationship with communities.
So one of the big things, I've done a lot of work both on behalf of my community as well as other communities in terms of trying to identify where ancestral remains might be. Particularly in the United States, we do have a law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which mandated that each museum, repository, et cetera, that had received federal funds look in their collections and identify what they had in terms of ancestral remains as well as funerary objects and sacred items and items of cultural patrimony, and then make sure that those tribes that might be interested in those items being returned to them, to reach out to them. So a lot of times what I tell tribes in the United States is to go to the National Park Service, which hosts the database of all of these lists of items that these federal repositories, in order to go and look at the lists that have been submitted on behalf of these repositories, as a first way of getting an idea of where ancestral remains are. Unfortunately, there are a lot of smaller institutions which have yet to comply with this. So a lot of what I do is talk to communities, asking them, what local amateur archaeology societies are you aware of? Are there small local historic societies that focus on historical items? Also looking at your local Boy Scout troop, Girl Scout troop, etc., because a lot of times they have badges for archaeology and they go out and illegally dig on lands, and in some instances have collections. So trying to find where those items are takes a lot of sleuthing. And once you do get around to finding those items, being able to contact that museum, you have to use particular language. So exactly as was talked about before, is that there's a particular type of language that anthropologists, archaeologists, and museums use. And so a lot of times community members who don't have that type of language, in order to request information about their ancestors, get shut down and or ignored for a variety of different reasons. So one of the things that I do in my spare time is talk to tribal communities and teach them what that language is. That way, when that letter comes to the museum, you're talking about collections, you're talking about accessions, you're talking about provenience, provenance. Those are very specific archaeological museumology terms that when you're reaching out, they'll be able to understand and then better respond to you. It's about making sure that each community is getting the information that they need in order to start those conversations about the ancestors.
First, I just want to state that the disciplines that I represent, archaeology and physical anthropology, are embedded in a very colonial history. There's no getting around it. And in our disciplines and in our work, we work in various museum institutions that have ancestors and archaeological materials that have been taken out of context and put on shelves. So that very picture is sometimes hard to, see if you're a community member. And then being on the other side, being that archaeologist or physical anthropologist that has to engage with that community, there's always that history and baggage that you and the community have to work with. I'm very fortunate that I came into the field in the reverse way, where from my very first time working in the field, I worked with or took my guidance from the community that I was working with, because it just seemed like the right thing to do. And it was contrary to a lot of my colleagues who don't have the same ideas, the same beliefs that, even as far as to say, oh, community members don't want to know about their ancestors, they don't want to know about their cultural materials. And I've been very fortunate to work with Desiree Martinez and other members of the community, in which I take my guidance on, well, what information do you want to know about your community? So there are situations in which, yes, like Lillian was pointing out, and Desiree as well, that there's what's needed for NAGPRA, and then there's what the community wants to know. And there are osteologists who just use their ancestors as tools of science, and then there's osteologists who provide information that helps the community put the ancestors back in the ground the way they're supposed to.
And to build on that, it's one of the things that we want to highlight is that the way in which we do things is important. The way in which institutions approach a project or approach working with collections or working with ancestral remains or working with communities is important. It's not just always about that final product, but allowing those interactions and those communications to influence what that final product will be and the shape that it will take and the impact that it has. And recognizing that as museum professionals, we do not know everything, and we probably shouldn't know everything anyway. And it's really a matter of working with communities to fill in all of those gaps and working together to reach goals that are important to communities, because so much of the work that museums take on is really on the backs of the various decades of labor from many indigenous communities in this country and in many other places, from the collections that were gathered from many communities to the programming to various artworks. And it's important to recognize that there's a incredible history and incredible expertise and incredible knowledge that's held with indigenous communities, and to build those bridges and see where they lead.
I think one of the most important things about thinking about and trying to establish a collaborative relationship with the museum, and this is something that I always do and I talk about, is called setting the tone. So the first time you meet together in order to discuss issues of repatriation or care of the ancestors while in the stewardship of the museum is to basically start on a baseline in recognizing that everybody has the same goal and understanding to take care of the ancestors. And then once that happens and we're all striving to take care of the ancestors and keeping that at the forefront, that it's not about you, it's not about your ego, it's not about your placement in academia, it's not about forwarding your career, it's about getting the ancestors and taking care of them. To recognize that they were horribly treated in the past, that we are now as caretakers of them to make sure that we acknowledge to them they've been mistreated, and that we are now trying to rectify that, both in the interim of, you know, having them in museums and taking care of them so they no longer decompose, so that in the end, eventually having them going back into the ground so they can continue their journey. That's one of the kind of most important things to start. That way there is no adversarial relationship. And of course, sometimes there's people that just don't want to play the game and will be contrary to whatever you as a tribal member may bring up, but you have to always remind yourself, okay, then let's step back and let's see if we can get that common ground again. And so once that happens and everybody establishes this is what we're trying to do, what's in the best interest of the ancestors, then true communication, true trust starts to develop, and then we start to work together to create solutions for whatever may come up. So in the instance of what we presented at the conference, in the case of an ancestor that was on display and had resins put onto him after he got removed from the ground, what's the best way to take care of him so that when he gets moved, he's not going to fall apart, and in the future thinking about what do we need to do in order to prepare him for reburial in the future.
I think it's important to recognize that community members that you may be working with have a list of things that they need to do to properly care for the relatives that are in the collection, you know, and I think our job is to get out of the way and to create an environment where they can freely do what they need to do. And if that means burning sage in the building, anywhere in the building, it means making sure that fire alarms don't go off, that there aren't these disruptive circumstances, these disruptive results, making sure that people have food and water and coffee throughout the day if they need that on a visit, making sure that folks have parking, that they are compensated for their time in an honorarium maybe. It's important to acknowledge that that is also a form of work and labor and energy that they're giving to our knowledge of properly caring for the ancestors, and that there has to be this open access that is directed by the tribes and by community members, and that is welcoming and that is open, and where people can feel what they need to feel as they do this kind of work. And I think it's these very simple humanizing things that sometimes tend to be forgotten when you're wrapped up in all of this work with dealing with the collections and accession numbers and notes that don't make sense. And it's important to recognize that the descendants of the ancestors that we have in our collections are here, and they want to see and they want to be informed, and they have things that they need to do. And so sometimes it's really a matter of being a good host to that work, and stepping out of the way and making sure that the foundation is laid there for a relationship to develop to begin with.
I think to kind of add to that as well, it's also important, like if we're to give advice to our fellow colleagues to kind of share our own experiences based on the projects that we've worked together on. At Autry, I think institutions and organizations need to understand that this is a heavy topic and it's difficult, so putting no time frame on it, if possible, is best, because there's no way to predict a response, a feeling, an emotion. That's something you can't control. There is not a process of handling with ancestors that are on the shelf, and that is an organic experience, and it's been our experience to let it just be and just provide the space and the opportunity to make that happen. So everything that my colleagues said here, and I mean, I think because we've so far had 2 or 3 successful collaborations in which we were to work together and take information and pass it back and forth in a way that we saw to be extremely beneficial, is what we're trying to give to other communities. And even speaking as like one who works in the archaeology and osteology, there's like no preset, if I can pass on any message to fellow colleagues, there's no preset ideology that you have to provide all the information, do all the science behind what you are trained to do. We can change the discipline, and we can change it by constant collaboration with the tribal communities and our fellow department members. And that's another thing that we were able to show within our presentations, is that departments have been operating in silos, and we've had these opportunities kind of break down doors for us to work together to best give tribal communities what they need to get, their ancestors either moved in this case, taken care of, housed better, or ultimately repatriated.
Mm-hmm. And don't wait for tribal communities to come to you. Like, do the work of reaching out to them, and if you can, do the work of visiting them, and in their tribal offices, in their communities, getting to know people. Something as simple as adding funding for dinner on a tribal visit can go a long way. So that you can all sit together at a table and discuss the plans for moving forward with the work that you want to do, and then set a day for the next time. And then at that next meeting, set a date for the next meeting, so that you have a continued building of a relationship, and really invest in the building of that. Like any other relationship in your life, this is an important relationship to have if you want to do this work well. So it's a matter of prioritizing that work of building a relationship. I mean, we've been working together for a really long time now. She just shot me a dirty look, but I know it's a look of love and affection, and it's because we've been working for nearly a decade, and there are things now that we can discuss with so much more ease because of that work. There's care that we can give to ancestors and collections that's complicated and difficult, but that we can do that with relative ease because of that relationship. And working across departments is also important. Don't wait for your colleagues to come to you either. If you know that you need to discuss something with the conservator, and that a conservator needs to engage with the community or shift their practices based on community needs, start that conversation early before you need to. Have those conversations before you're working with the tribe. Set yourself up internally to succeed as much as possible, and reach out whenever you can.